Welcome to Stage 2 of the computer simulation, which introduces the biological reproduction of the population and models the handling of important events for individuals, such as injury, sickness, marriage, birth, and death. For those new to this simulation project, it should be noted that each stage of the simulation builds on the previous stage, so watching Stage 1 first is recommended. There's a link in the description. In Stage 1, we left the hypothetically stranded island population, having established the basic elements of their culture, through the manifestation of their evolved brain processes. We saw that the neurochemical processes of their brains created a range of specific physical structures, such as the care center, the worship center, the tool shed, the fort, and the performance stage. And they also created a small-scale economy, which supplies them with enough food for their population size, through the manifestation of rationality, as a range of tools, which made food collection, processing, and distribution possible. All of these elements of their culture are universal elements of all human cultures, and as was outlined in previous videos, they are merely the manifestation of specific areas of all human brains. Now let's move on to their biological reproduction on the island, as they start to expand across it, in order to make more space for the increase in their population size. Just a reminder that this hypothetical situation is occurring about 200 years ago, on an island that is isolated. So they wouldn't expect to be rescued, and would be planning for the establishment of a permanent settlement on the island. Before proceeding, it's worth giving a quick description of some operational aspects of the simulation. Specifically, how we'll move around the screen. This is an image of the basic layout, and what you are seeing is the full screen view of the simulation. This full screen window will be broken up into 4 smaller sections. Section A, B, C, and D. So if we want to look at the detail in one section, we can do so by the simple press of a key. This is Section A. Section B. Section C. And Section D. This will allow for a quick movement around the screen, and a detailed view of the various aspects of the simulation. Now back to full screen mode. So returning to this 50 humans, that form the starting population of the island culture. They know now that a lot of children will be born in the future, and they also know that many community members will suffer from injury, sickness, and possibly even death, in the coming months and years. So the rational humans set to work building a large hospital to deal with all these contingencies. As in Stage 1, the construction time for buildings is greatly accelerated here, for the sake of keeping the video length manageable. Once the hospital and morgue are complete, it will be staffed by 2 or 3 humans. These will be humans with a first neurochemical preference of other awareness, and a second neurochemical preference of rationality. As these types of humans would be the most likely to work as doctors and nurses, in a traditional culture such as this, as in modern cultures. These caregiving humans will always be at the hospital, except when there are no patients, in which case they will help with food collection or cooking. So now we are about to see the first injury. When a human is injured, they will drop to the ground, as in this case, and then be taken to the hospital. Injured humans are treated straight away, and they will receive a crutch and leg bandage, or just a crutch. They are then released from the hospital, and one bandage is taken from the storage area here, which will need to be replaced. They also receive one lot of herbal medicine to help with their recovery, which will also need to be replaced. At this stage, we'll say that it takes a human 1 week to recover, during which time they don't do any work, but merely spend time at their preferred area, or at the care center. They do, however, attend any community events, and also the Friday and Saturday night performances. We'll configure the simulation so that one human gets injured every 5 days. So usually there will be 2 humans every week who are injured, which seems realistic for a population of 50 individuals who are engaging with the natural world every day, without protective clothing. These injury parameters can be altered if necessary in future stages. The important point here is that the rate and severity of injury in any population impacts the collection and processing of resources, as an injured human is taken out of the workforce for a period of time. So the injury parameters are something worth altering in the simulation, to see what effect they can have on the future size and possible character of the culture. But more on that in future stages. Next we have the situation where a human becomes sick. Once again, when a human is sick, they will drop to the ground and be taken to the hospital. In this case, however, they will be covered by a leaf blanket, to indicate a more serious condition, to that of an injured human. Sickness will usually be an age-related illness. In this case, the human has just turned 70 years old. At which age we'll say that all humans become seriously ill. A sick human will spend the night at the hospital, and be administered 3 lots of herbal medicine. The next morning, the human will either survive or pass away. For the time being, we'll make all sick humans who turn 70 deceased. Once again, this parameter is something that will be altered and experimented with in future stages. Life expectancy has obvious implications for the future population size of any culture. When a human is deceased, they are moved to the morgue. Then in the afternoon, 2 rational humans come to make a coffin for the deceased. Once a coffin is made, a funeral event is added to the community events list. In real situations, funerals are usually about 3 days after the death of an individual, depending on the culture and religion in question. But to accommodate for the time constraints here, we'll set all the funerals to the next day. So we see the funeral service conducted the next morning. Usually, in the case of a real deceased person, only their extended family and friends would attend the funeral. But in this simulated small island community, we would expect everyone to attend. After the service, the coffin is placed at the back of the worship center. And in the afternoon, 2 rational humans come to dig a grave. Note that the rational humans continue to make tools, as required, just as they did in stage 1 of the simulation. Here they have made stone shovels to dig the hole. And now we see the headstone placed at the back of the worship center, which will become the graveyard, as is usually the case in small-scale traditional cultures. Now let's move on to the more pleasant cultural activities of marriage and birth. We'll assume that our stranded population is composed of genetically distinct individuals, who could therefore mate with anyone in the population. The humans have been socializing at the performance center every evening, and gradually formed relationships, based on the customs of a traditional society. Now that they have food security and a sense of welfare, they start to pair up. We'll say that every Saturday night, a couple feel that they are compatible enough to get married, and announce that they are engaged. The question of human mate choice is a complex one, and something that this simulation might be able to throw light on. But for the time being, the only compatibility check that is being done here is based on age. As is the case in most cultures, females prefer to marry males that are older than they are, and males to marry females that are younger than them. So we'll use this simple criteria to determine which female humans marry which males, based on their order on the population list. Only 1 couple announce they are engaged each Saturday night. And in keeping with the time constraints of this video, a wedding is set for the next Wednesday. It's a midweek date, to reduce the impact on food collection, as once again everyone will attend the wedding, and so not be able to collect food, or cook food. We'll move forward now, to next Wednesday, to see the wedding ceremony. This symbol here is an arbitrary universal symbol that represents the public vows and joining together of two individuals in a committed relationship. As soon as a couple are married, the construction workers get to work building a house for them. This area will become the residential area for the population. And with the current population size, we'll only need about 24 houses to be built. Once the house is complete, the newly married Humes move straight in and no longer eat at the care center with the other Humes. So gradually we'll see an emptying of the care center as each married couple moves into their own home. However, for the time being, all the food will still be stored and cooked at the care center and then taken by the married Humes to their houses. It's worth stopping to mention at this point that a new feature has been added to the simulation in this stage 2. It's now possible to fast forward the simulation to any future date we want, while continuing to do all the daily processing. So we'll fast forward a few months now, to see that 12 marriages have occurred and 12 houses built. And now we'll move forward another few months, to see that all the Humes have now married. Except for 3 who didn't marry, which is typical in any population of about 50 individuals. And these 3 are married, but are on duty. As soon as a couple are married, the female is assumed to become pregnant in about 3 months' time, and to give birth about 9 months after that. So a date for the birth of the child is added to the community events calendar for 1 year in advance. So let's use the fast forward feature again to move 1 year ahead to see the first birth in the population. Just before the first birth is due, a construction task is added to the community task list to build an extension to the hospital that will function as a birth ward. So we see the rational Humes starting the construction process. When a Hume is due to give birth, she'll be taken to the birth ward. And the normal procedure will then be for her to stay overnight and to give birth the next morning. Here's the birth. She'll remain at the hospital for another night with the baby and be given 1 lot of herbal medicine. If all goes well, she'll return home the next day with the infant. Then she'll remain at home, caring for the infant, until it's 5 years old. At which time, the child will go to school. Normally in traditional cultures, the grandparents would play an important part in minding and caring for a child, while the mother returns to the workforce in some capacity. However, in this situation of a stranded population, there are no grandparents. So in order to handle this unusual case, we'll restrict the number of women who can have children by making about a third of them older than 40. So all the women in the population who are older than 40 do marry, but they don't have children. This will allow them to continue doing the essential tasks of collecting and cooking food and caring for others, while the younger women biologically reproduce the population. This brings us to the representation of the family, of the reproducing couples. We have the adults. The young adults aged 16 and 17. The teenagers, 13 to 15. The children aged 5 to 12. The infants aged 3 and 4. And the babies from birth to 2 years old. What neurochemical preferences newborns inherit, and how those preferences change throughout the child's life, is one of the central concerns of this computer simulation. And will be an area of extensive research and experimentation in later stages. But for the time being, we'll just assume that all newborns have strong neurochemical preferences for self-awareness and sensory awareness. As the processes of evolution have shaped infants to be preoccupied with their own welfare, and to be constantly aware of all the new sensory experiences surrounding them. These two brain processes then simply improve the chances of survival for the infant, so a preference for them would presumably be selected for by evolution. So all newborns will have yellow and violet clothing until they are 5 years old. At which point, we'll assume that the first 5 years of influence of the parents, particularly the mother, has shaped the child's neurochemical preferences. So a child will take the mother's first preference as their first, and take the father's first preference as their second preference. Then when a child becomes a teenager, because we are dealing with a traditional society, a male child will usually be more influenced by its father, and a female by its mother. So we'll reflect this in the teenager's clothing, which will then carry on through to adulthood. This is all an initial temporary arrangement, because, as mentioned, the forces that shape the neurochemical preferences of individuals throughout their life, from inherited traits to the family and the culture in question, will require extensive analysis. Along with the birth of infants, we will also have to simulate infant mortality, which was particularly prevalent in traditional cultures of 200 years ago. As a starting point, we'll make the infant mortality rate about 30%. So roughly 1 in 3 newborns die at birth, as we see here. But it does vary from female hume to female hume. Some lose 1 in 3, some lose 1 in 2. When a hume loses a newborn, she returns home, and the deceased infant is then treated the same as a deceased adult. It's moved to the morgue, where a coffin is made. A funeral is held the next day, and finally the deceased infant is buried in the graveyard, but with a smaller headstone. The smaller headstones will allow us to quickly get a visual indication of the infant mortality rate at any time. The infant mortality rate for each female then influences her fertility rate. Females continue having children up until the age of 40, which is typical in traditional cultures of 200 years ago. And they usually have a child, on average, every 2 years. So over the course of their reproductive life, when we factor in the mortality rate, we would expect a female to have 5 or 6 children, depending on whether she loses 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 children. 6 children is the typical number for an average-sized traditional family. So over time, we would see a gradual increase in the number of children in the population. And when the first infant reaches 5 years old, the rational humes are set the task of constructing a school, as we see here. The teacher will have a first neurochemical preference of metaphysics, which is usually the case in traditional cultures, for primary school teachers. We'll fast forward a few months here, to see that all the first year of children born are now of school age. The children spend 6 days a week at school, including during the midday meal, and return home in the evening, and on Sundays. If a mother doesn't have any preschool-aged children at home, she'll return to the workforce during school hours. As more children are born, and they get older, eventually one will turn 13. At this time, the rational humes are once again tasked with building a school for these older children. In this case, however, in regard to the school teacher, he has a first preference of rationality, as these teenagers will need to be taught how to make rational tools, and to function in logical and practical ways, in order to contribute to the acquisition, processing, and distribution of resources. And then when the children reach the age of 16, they leave school and join the workforce, engaging in the traditional gender-based activities of this culture. Males catching and collecting fish and coconuts. Females collecting yams and berries, and cooking and preparing the food. By the way, the teachers at both the schools are only male at this time, because of the lack of females available, due to their childbearing activities. This will change once the population reaches a reasonable size. And so we see now For this island population, a simulation of the core elements of both biological and cultural reproduction occurring. The adult humans find compatible partners. They then marry and have children. The children start school at age 5, and then go to secondary school at age 13. Once they reach 16, they enter the workforce. While in the meantime, humans continue to be treated and managed for injury, sickness, and death. And finally, we would have the following situation, where a male and female human from the new generation get engaged and marry. And a house is built for them. Then in a year's time, they too have their own child. Thereby starting the biological reproductive cycle of the population all over again. So all things considered, quite a lot has been included in this stage too. The simulation as a whole is moving forward well. We've gone from the initial stranded population, in stage 1, who reproduced the basic cultural aspects of the traditional culture they came from, to this larger population of humans, who are now capable of treating and handling their sick, injured, and deceased members, and feel secure enough to marry and have large numbers of offspring, which is typical of traditional societies. And the children can then attend 2 levels of school, and eventually leave school with the rational skills needed to help maintain and expand the culture. And finally, the next generation of humans can also marry and have offspring, and so complete the reproductive cycle of the population. And in regard to the functional aspects of the computer simulation, in this stage 2, we now have the introduction of the very important fast-forward feature. This will allow us to do numerous forms of analysis on the simulated culture. Just as a very simple example, we can now see how the mortality rate affects the population size over time. Starting with the original island population of 50 humans. First, if the mortality rate is about 25%, we see that after fast-forwarding the simulation, 20 years, the population size is about 120 humans, and the number of deceased humans is 26. If we now increase the mortality rate to 50%, and rerun the simulation, we see that after 20 years, the population size is now 94 humans, and the number of deaths has increased to 64 humans. And we could fast forward the simulation, 50 or 100 years, while continuing to do all the daily processing, to see what the results would be. Or if we wanted to, we could see what effect a change to any parameter might cause, to the population and culture as a whole. Be that a change related to population demographics, as we just saw, or a change that's relevant to the question of nature versus nurture, or one that affects the distribution of the neurochemical preferences across the population, or one that has a bearing on the future political system, or even a more general change that affects the overall character of the culture. All of these types of inquiry and analysis will be possible in future stages, thanks to the use of fast forward. So this new feature of the simulation will be an essential future analytical tool. Overall then, good progress has been made in this stage too. We now have biological and cultural reproduction of the population, and the means by which to analyze changes to them over long periods of time. But this computer simulation is really only just beginning. Hopefully you'll be back for stage 3. Until then, bye for now.